Welcome, everybody. We will get started. So thank you for joining us today for this webinar. We wanted to share with you impact stories, a contribution analysis of participatory action research on preventing sexual exploitation and abuse in humanitarian aid. And I'm here with my co-presenters, who I'll introduce in a moment. We're really excited to share this webinar as part of the gLocal Evaluation Week. Next slide. And as we are sharing, a little bit more about our institutions and ourselves, we also welcome for you to share in the chat, to introduce yourself, where you are joining from. Any questions that you have can be directed to the Q&A box, but the chat can be a place where we can all just get to know each other a little bit. So please do that. So my name is Alina Potts. I work as a research scientist with the Global Women's Institute, and we are based in George Washington University in the US. And our work is in research, education or training and advocacy to advance gender equality. We do a lot of work on research that looks at response and prevention to violence against women and girls. And our vision is of a world where women and girls enjoy equal rights and opportunities alongside men and boys and are free from violence, discrimination, and coercion. And I'm joined by my colleague, Andrea Corris, who's also works at the Global Women's Institute as the research associate. And then I'll hand it over to our co-presenter, Dr. Sarah Morton, to introduce herself and Matter of Focus.
Hi, I'm Sarah Morton from Matter of Focus. I think maybe we have a next slide. Yeah, we're a mission-based company based in Edinburgh in Scotland, but we work in lots of places around the world. And we basically help organizations understand and track their impact. So we're helping organizations to understand what outcomes and impacts are important to them, what data and evidence they need, and we do that through software and consultancy support. So we've been working together with Andrea and Alina recently to use contribution analysis, which is the foundation of our approach and our software, to understand the impact of their particular project.
Great. It's lovely to be here with everyone today. So I'm going to quickly go through the meeting objectives so we have an understanding of what we're going to talk about in today's webinar. So first, we're going to explore the use of contribution analysis in impact evaluation. Then we're going to introduce OutNav, a software we've been using to support our contribution analysis that is a product of Matter of Focus. And then we'll provide a case study of how our project empowered aid and our experience using OutNav in our ongoing contribution analysis. So we're going to start off with a quick poll. Our first question, let me just launch the poll here. So our first question is, how well do you think your evaluation methods highlight your impact on a scale of 0 to 5? And our second question is, have you heard of or used contribution analysis before attending this webinar? Okay, so we've got some answers coming in. About 67% of us, 75% of us say that from a scale from 0 to 5, they feel that their evaluation methods highlight their impact at about a 3. So there's some confidence there, but room for improvement. And in terms of how many of us have heard of contribution analysis or used it, about 71% of us have heard of it, and 29 to 30% have not heard of contribution analysis before. So that's actually a great spread of engagement with contribution analysis, and as well as kind of folks who are curious about learning about a different method. So we're going to go move on to the next slide now with our last question. And we encourage you to put your answers here in the chat, but we'd really love to know what comes to mind when you think about contribution analysis as an impact evaluation method. And we're really interested in hearing from those folks who've never heard or used contribution analysis before. So please go ahead and put your comments in the chat. Just a one-word answer.
Andrea, someone's saying the chat is disabled for them.
Yeah,
Okay,
I think it might be disabled. I think instead maybe what we can do is have everybody put their notes in the Q&A and we'll be able to see it there.
okay, yeah. Okay. Time consuming, thanks, Cora. It is time intensive, but we think it's worth it. Okay, well, folks, as you join, please consider typing in the Q&A box your thoughts about what comes to mind when you think about contribution analysis. And we're gonna pop over to our colleague Sarah now, who's going to tell us a bit more about contribution analysis and the method itself.
Thanks, Andrea. So I got really interested in contribution analysis when I was doing my PhD, which is looking at how research impact could be assessed. And the thing about contribution analysis is it's really for those situations where it's difficult to know you're making a difference. And there's some reasons why, so in some particular situations and some kinds of work, it's difficult to know you're making a difference. So I'm just going to go through some of those now. So the first one, if I can have the next slide, is that if you're working in a very complex context where there's multiple influences on change, where maybe the environment is quite fast moving, where it's hard to make predictions for the longer term, where you do something in one place, it's quite different from when you do it in another place or another time. So I know a lot of you will be working in these kind of contexts, these fast moving contexts where change is really influenced by multiple things. And if I can have the next slide, that means that it's really difficult to sort of isolate what your initiative does compared with all the other things that are going on for the same people that you want to influence in whatever way. So, you know, there's their own personality, the people, their families, what other services or projects or initiatives are going on, culture with a small c mainly, what the current and past policy environment is, you know, especially in this area of gender-based violence, or quite often dealing with the legacy of previous policies where particularly children but also women weren't protected as much as they are now. So we've got all of these different factors influencing change. So it's not like we can just, you know, the whole test tube type scientific approach doesn't work here because we can't actually isolate one initiative in this kind of situation. And I think the other thing that's where contribution analysis really makes a lot of sense, if you go to the next slide, and this is usually all of these things I've already said, is where people are at the heart of change. So it's not like it's not a drug, is it? You're not giving people a new drug and looking for an outcome. You're actually doing work where you're inspiring people or educating or empowering them, often influencing them in different ways, maybe supporting, connecting people. And it's this people-based work which is much more difficult to understand when you're trying to understand its impact. And I suppose what we've come to understand at Matter of Focus, if I can have the next slide, is that quite often we try and apply, or people try and apply, methods that are too simple to these complex contexts. So they try and apply things where, you know, you're trying to do a before and after test, but maybe there isn't a before, you know, because it's people. There's no empty state when you start. There's no finished state necessarily. And quite often we try and make things much simpler in order to manage them. On the other hand, sometimes we go the other way. We're like, oh, this is really complex. We need to map it all out. And I don't know if some of you have looked at complexity maps. Some of them are brilliant, but they are quite overwhelming. So we're constantly trying to get to this nice, meaningful, proportionate space where we're making things simple enough, but we're recognizing the complexity of the environment, and we're not oversimplifying, but it's got to be manageable, hasn't it? It's got to be proportionate. So this is where we like to get to, and it's a bit of an art getting to this point. It's not one point. You'll see I've made it a bar on this chart. We're all bumping up and down here, working with this conundrum. Okay, so there's a few things that we do at Matter of Focus routinely with all of our clients, if you go to the next slide, that really helps us manage this in this complex situation with this kind of work that I'm sure most of you are involved in. So One of the things that can really help us navigate complex and fast changing environments is a focus on outcomes or impacts. So really thinking about, well, what difference are we trying to make? What's the ultimate goal for our work here? And if things change in the environment, like a COVID epidemic, for example, or a big political upheaval or whatever else it is, you're still focusing on the thing it is you want to do, the difference you want to make, and you can adapt how you do it to that changing environment. And just before we get into this, I want to just be really clear about what I mean by an outcome, because I think there's a lot of confusion. So if we go to the next slide, this is one of our most popular slides at Matter of Focus. We call it the cake slide. And it's really showing that the difference between outputs and outcomes using this analogy of baking. So the inputs are the ingredients, the process is baking, and then we have this beautiful pink cake with 3 candles on. But we're not really so interested in the cake. We're much more interested in, does it make the child happy? So we're looking for happy children, not cakes. And the cake's only going to make the child happy if they like pink. They wouldn't have preferred to spend time with you rather than you slogging away in the kitchen making a cake, or whatever else it is. Whatever else is going on for those children. So we're thinking very carefully about this relationship between what we do and what difference it makes, and being really clear about the difference between an output and an outcome. And if you go to the next slide, we have a very particular way at Matter of Focus of mapping any initiative's contribution to outcomes. And this is what Alina and Andrea have been doing with their project. So we'll have the slide after this, please. So we use this framework. We've spent a long time honing this contribution analysis framework into some very plain language. And all of you familiar with logic models or theories of change will, of course, recognize the general principles here. But what we've done is create a version which is completely process-led, and it doesn't have time in it. So you'll quite often see models like this that have inputs, outputs, and then sort of short-term, medium-term, or long-term outcomes. Instead of that, we always start off at the top end there on the right, thinking about what is better for people or communities. So you'll have a mission statement, you'll have organizational aims, you'll have project aims. Those sorts of things can contribute to this thinking about what difference in the world do we want to make. So Alina outlined for the Empowered Aid what that is. It's, you know, gender equality, a world where girls and women have the same chances as men and boys. So that would be what is going to be better. And then we scroll right back to what is it we're actually delivering? What are the activities? Who are we engaging and involving? And importantly, in our model, we have this step called how they feel, which is how do people react? And the reason we have this, based on what I've already said, is if we're working with people, this is the crux of making a difference, because if people don't feel included and listened to, respected, that they trust you, all of those really important things that I know lots of projects spend a long time working on and refining, then it's very difficult for anything else to happen. Quite often that can be a dead end. If you get engagement wrong, no other change happens. So we really call out that process of engagement and think about not just who you're engaging, but how are they reacting? Is it what you hoped? And then hopefully if people engage well and, you know, decide whatever it is you were offering is something they want and like and want to be involved in, then they can learn and gain some things. So this is 2 further levels of outcomes. And then they can do things differently. So some sort of behavior, policy or practice change, which hopefully then links back up to what is better for people and communities. So I'll show you an example of this if we go to the next slide. This is some work I did with an initiative called Global Kids Online that some of you might know. It's UNICEF and the London School of Economics. And we were doing an impact study on their work, basically sharing. They have partners all around the world who do research on children's experiences online, and to understand what that looks like in different countries. And what the Global Kids Online team do is then share that. So you'll see in what we do, share knowledge through networking, policy debate, and acting as a critical friend. And if you look right at the top end there, there's some quite ambitious aims around all internet governance regulations having a child lens, the industry taking responsibility for children, a more robust international policy and regulatory framework. So then we're really tracking through like who's involved in that, how do they need to feel. So in this case, they're saying Global Kids Online is seen as a world premier resource, the team is seen as experts, people are becoming more aware that there is evidence they can draw on, and then the learning outcomes, I'm not going to go through them all, and we'll share you these slides afterwards if you want to read it in more detail. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to say, like, why is it good to set out this, what we would call an outcome map or a pathway to impact? And this is one of our clients as a national mental health charity here in Scotland. And they say sometimes without the map, it's easier to feel you kind of lose the bigger picture. Whereas having this, I found has been very helpful for myself. And when I'm talking to the team, to show everything we're doing day to day. This is how it contributes to the goals that we have set, and this is what we want to be and do, or to do and be as a service. So if you go to the next slide, we like to say life is easier with an outcome map. So by doing this work of really setting out how the things you do contribute to the outcomes you care about through this contribution analysis framework, it helps really clarify the change you seek, and it can be a way of communicating that as well. You're making that clear link between activities and outcomes, and what is your project's contribution to those outcomes. So you're making it really clear the things that you're doing and how they link to those outcomes. It can be a great way of building shared understanding. I really recommend you can download a set of the headings from our website, and you can use it in a partnership discussion or those kind of discussions where you're really trying to nail what the project's about. So it's really good for that. But I'm going to show you how it also helps streamline the data and evidence you need to show that you're making a difference and to demonstrate your impact, and provides an evaluation framework. And as I just mentioned at the beginning, it can be a really simple communication tool, because in that one I showed you previously, those are the headlines for a highly complex long-term piece of work that just shows you, generally speaking, this is what they're doing and why it's important. So I'm going to show you, I'm just going to have a few more slides to show how we use this to build an evaluation framework. So if we go to the next slide, in fact, you can just skip to the one after. So outcome maps help with data challenges, because they help us think about what data do we need in order to tell the story? How are we going to use that data, and how are we going to make sure we've got it in the right place? And when my colleagues here go on to show their example, you'll see exactly what this looks like for them. But I wanted to give you an example that's focusing on a much simpler project for the sake of this webinar. So if we go to the next slide, here's a very simple outcome map. It's actually a demonstration project that we use at Matter of Focus, and it's a well-being project. So it's a person-centered well-being project that aims to improve people's well-being and improve local services through a process of helping people focus on what matters to them and the changes they want to seek in their own lives. And so the logic here is that people experiencing poor health and well-being engage with key workers, and they have conversations about what they want to do, and they start building the confidence and skills to change their lives, but also they access a range of relevant community supports. And that's the one I just want to highlight in on, just to show you how this works in terms of defining data. So if we go to the next slide, if we're thinking about this particular part of the map, how are we going to know this is happening? What do we need to understand this? So if you go to the next slide again, we can see that basically it helps us think about, okay, well, if we're going to know that people are accessing services, we might have internal records about people's use of services. We might then do some reviews of those to see, does it show us anything about people's access of services? If it doesn't, we might want to make sure that that's a bit of data we're collecting in our internal records. We might have formal feedback through surveys or exit interviews, those kinds of things. We might be asking people in those, have you used any community services since you've been working with us, or which community services, depending, of course, what you want to know. And then we would also have those sort of informal interactions or formal interactions between practitioners and people using the project, and those would be the sort of questions that could also be collected informally, and practitioners could start building up their own practice understanding of this particular question. So the purpose of this is just to show you how a map, an outcome map, helps you use this contribution analysis framework and make it real and make it work for you in terms of understanding change. So if you just go to the next slide, it helps us use data well, because it helps us really think about what data is good enough for us. for any particular setting for our purposes and our audience. So if it's a external funder, it might be, depending on their preferences and their style, you might need very robust triangulated evidence, or you might just need some reflections. It would, if it's a training course, you might have more ability to collect data. If it's a pioneering new service, it might be a bit more light touch. I don't know. There's all of these questions around what is good enough in this setting. And then what we do in our software is we then say, we rate it. So we say, how is this, what's this evidence telling us about our progress? And we make a progress rating on a color code, on a traffic light, red, yellow, green scale. And then we make a confidence rating. How confident are we in our data? So do we think it's robust enough for us? And that helps. And we do this analysis across the map, and it gives us this nice picture, if you go to the next slide, please, of where things are going better or worse and how confident we are in our data and evidence. So you'll see the traffic light colors are progress, and there's also a little word on each slide if colors aren't your thing. And then the strength of color, or the other rating, is confidence. So it might be that we've got great confidence and really good evidence, you know, we have great progress and really good evidence. It might be we think we've got great progress, but the evidence isn't that strong. It might be we're much less sure. But these maps can give us this real sense of where do we need to improve our data and where do we need to improve our performance. And I'm going to just quickly share with you a very short video. I think we've got time, haven't we, of how our software helps with this process.
Do you want to understand and evidence how the work you are doing changes people's lives? As someone doing complex work with people, you know that simple quantitative measures can't tell the full story of the work you do and the impact it has on the people and communities you care about. Maybe you have lots of data and feedback of different types, but are struggling to pull them together in a cohesive way that helps you evidence and demonstrate impact. Perhaps you want to embed ongoing evaluation into your organisation so you can learn and improve. At Matter of Focus, we have developed a practical and meaningful approach to help you navigate the complexity of how your work contributes to the outcomes that matter and measure it in a robust and manageable way. Our approach is backed up by our bespoke impact and outcome tracking software OutNav, alongside help and tailored support from our expert team. There are 4 main processes we use to support you to embed outcome and impact thinking into your work. Map your outcomes, audit your data, analyze your evidence, and report and reflect. We help you to map the outcomes and impacts that matter to your initiative, taking into account how they are influenced by the wider context you are working in. You probably already have an idea of the difference you want to make, so this might be a good place to start. It may be defined in your organization's mission statement or by your funders. Outcome mapping sets out a theory of change that clearly shows how what you do contributes to these goals. Our approach structures the complex thinking about how your work makes a difference in a simple enough way by identifying how change happens using 6 plain language headings. What we do, who with, how they feel, what they learn and gain, what they do differently, and what difference does this make? Once you have an outcome map, it becomes the lens through which you think about your work, what evidence you need, and how you want to demonstrate your impact. To do this, we start with the data and evidence you already have. A data audit sorts out this evidence against your map. OutNav allows you to bring your data, feedback, and evidence together into one system, assigning evidence to the different steps of the outcome map you have created. You will develop a plan to assess your existing data and collect further evidence to fill in any gaps. The next stage is to carry out analysis to assess how well your initiative is progressing towards each of its desired outcomes. OutNav's intuitive color coding system gives you a quick overview of where things are working well and what areas need improvement, and where evidence is stronger or weaker. Embedding the process with ongoing discussion, reflection, analysis, and reporting can help develop your capacity as a learning organisation. OutNav allows you to generate reports at the click of a button, which can be shared securely with funders, partners, and other members of your team. We facilitate regular events to share learning and reflection between organisations in our community and beyond. We also run free online help sessions every week, where you can chat to our evaluation consultants about your progress and get advice on any challenges you have. The matter of focus approach provides a robust way to create a shared vision of impact and outcomes, to understand and track how change happens, and to demonstrate the impact of your work to funders, stakeholders, or partners. If you're part of a pioneering organisation or team that really cares about meaningful impact and wants to embed and share learning to make the best difference you can, this is an approach for you.
Okay, thank you. I thought that might be a good way of giving just a quick overview of what OutNav is like. And I'm going to pass now on to Alina, who's going to talk about the Empowered Aid case study. Oh, I can't remember who's starting, if it's Alina or Andrea.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. So I will kick off our case study of Empowered Aid. And really, we're very much in the process of doing everything that Sarah's just described. So we are pausing to reflect, as we like to do mid-process, and share our experiences thus far, conducting a contribution analysis of what is now 6 years of research and programming. Next slide. So the driving question behind Empowered Aid is, how might the ways we deliver humanitarian aid increase risk of sexual exploitation and abuse, which is abbreviated here as SEA, within affected populations? And this is really driven by a lack of knowledge on the magnitude of SEA in humanitarian context. Despite that, over the past maybe 20 years now, we see repeated kind of times when it's come to light, often through media reports. So we know it's a huge issue and it's ongoing, and we need to do better. And Empowered Aid attempts to contribute to, the many initiatives working on this through specifically looking at how we can mitigate or reduce risk of SEA in the way that we deliver aid. So we have as our goal the creation or adaptation of aid delivery models that work to actively reduce power disparities and give women and girls a sustained voice in how aid is delivered. And this is with the recognition that these unequal gendered power imbalances underlie many forms of violence, gender-based violence, including SEA. And we really need to rectify some of these power imbalances to get at some of the root causes, while also doing better as a sector to identify and reduce risk in our own programming. Next slide. So the project has multiple phases. It's grounded in participatory action research, and this took place over the first about year and a half of the project, which started in 2018. This was in Uganda and Lebanon, which are two of the largest refugee hosting countries in the world. We worked with a group of about 30 women and girl co-researchers in each country and used participatory approaches to understand contextually relevant SEA risks. So what are the risks of SEA when trying to access certain types of aid in each country? They chose the types of aid, but things like food, water and sanitation, shelter, cash assistance, etc. This was followed by a phase of implementation science, which is essentially good programming. So taking the recommendations that came out of the participatory action research that came from the women and girls we worked with and all of the different community members we talked to, and actually trying them out. And for example, one of the recommendations was having more women aid workers. So in a food distribution in Bidi refugee settlement in northern Uganda, which is one of the places we were working, in one of the food distribution points, we adjusted it so that all of the staff were female and many of the volunteers. And then we compared the monitoring from that food distribution point to others. And at the same time, we adapted these monitoring tools, which are often used during and after distributions to understand how things went, people's satisfaction with what they were given, to also ask about the SEA risk that came out in the research. So another example here, one risk was getting food safely home. It's big, it's bulky. Many times women have to rely on transport actors to assist them. And so asking about, how you were able to transport the food home if there are any issues, and also more proactively monitoring the exit area during distributions. This phase was followed by dissemination and uptake. where we focused a lot on documenting and disseminating products that were really aimed at our target audience, humanitarian actors and stakeholders in countries that are facing conflict and crisis. So we produced reports, but also tip sheets and policy briefs, trainings. We have a free online course that's available in 6 languages. So very much kind of thinking about how can we communicate and reach the people that need this information. And also we've been scaling out to an additional 4 countries and learning how to produce a toolkit for people who want to do this, you know, without the heavy lift of full-on participatory action research, but with participatory methods to contextualize risk and then apply them in their programming. Next slide. So we wanted to share with you a video. This will just be a short clip, and we actually have, these videos are from the course and they're all available on our YouTube page. The course is co-taught by the Women and Girl co-researchers, so recognizing them as experts that have a lot of knowledge to share with others. This video shares perspectives of several of the co-researchers. So today we'll hear from Mona, who was one of our Syrian co-researchers in Lebanon, on her experience as a co-researcher.
تجربتي كانت كتير منيحة وقوية، يعني خلتنا نقدر نحكي، خلتنا نقدر نعبر عن رأينا، نحكي اللي بدنا إياه، بس كان بدنا مين يعني يقلنا إنه نحكي يعني شو بدي أقولك، نعبر اللي بقلبنا. يعني تجربة كتير كانت منيحة وكتير قوية وخلتنا نقوي شخصيتنا كتير بشكل قوي.
Thank you. So yeah, there's much more on the YouTube page if anyone wants to subscribe, and also the course is free if you'd like to learn more. Next slide. So this is just a little visual of some of the resources I mentioned, some of the reports, toolkits, policy briefs. This on the right is a roadmap for organizations interested in using empowered aid, and these are all available freely on the website. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrea to talk about how we then attempted to capture some of this kind of multi-component, multi-year intervention with the contribution analysis approach.
Thanks, Alina. So yeah, I'm going to share a little bit about how we've been applying contribution analysis to empowered aid to better understand the impact stories of our program. So just to orient ourselves, what we've done so far, we've conducted an excavation of all of our program data from various sources, which was a very lengthy process. We then grouped the findings from this kind of high-level data review into a contribution analysis-like tracker that we created ourselves using Excel and Google Docs, which I'll show you shortly, quickly became quite unwieldy. And then we moved to the next phase, which was mapping outcomes and OutNav, which helped us improve our analysis and visualization capacity. And from there, we began to plot pathways of impact. Our next steps, just to reiterate where we are in our process, is to finish plotting our impact pathways and inputting our evidence from the various sources we're drawing from, to host validation workshops with various stakeholders across our project ecosystem, to see if what we're seeing in the data is reflected with their experience. Then the plan is to devise a data collection plan to fill those gaps that we find may exist, looking at what data we need to still collect to answer some of our questions and corroborate some of our stories of impact. And then the final step is to kind of in an iterative way, return to our data, reassess our impact pathways, and see what we have. So as you can see here, I want to give you a good sense of the kind of non-exhaustive but quite comprehensive list of sources that we've been drawing on for our contribution analysis. So you can see here we pulled reports, meeting minutes, internal assessments. Those included pre- and post-test training assessments we did in some of the earlier years of our program, reflection interviews with key stakeholders after certain years of implementation. We also reviewed primary data, so data we collected throughout the research in our program. This included household surveys, key informant interviews, participatory group discussions, and other forms of research. And then the third kind of major category of sources we've been drawing from are products and tools that we developed throughout the course of our work. This included toolkits, case studies, facilitation, guidelines, peer-reviewed publications. And then this last category, which is quite important, which we've titled Feedback Received, which is emails, anecdotal evidence we've gotten from our stakeholders and partners after different engagement events of their experience of the different activities and events and things that we've done. So we saved all of those and categorized them as best as possible throughout the years of our project. And I want to point you to this kind of snapshot of our Excel tracker that we were using to document our research dissemination and uptake, and it gives you a sense of how useful this kind of Excel is for documenting what you've done, but really becomes quickly not fit for purpose when you move into an analysis phase where you need some higher level capacity to deal with just the quality or the quantity of information. So this is, for us, this is where OutNav came in. We engaged Matter of Focus, learned about their software, and began to use the useful process, of moving our kind of high cut of information into the outcome map you see on the screen here. So conducting a broad review and synthesis of all of our historical program data was a very useful first step. But one could actually start here with the process of building out an outcome map, using your theory of change as a starting point and adding to it as your data review and analysis and collection progresses. But so for us, this process really forced us to get very clear on our outcome pathway, furnish each of these stepping stones with information that eventually began to start telling stories of impact. And one important note I want to make here is the how they feel domain, which Sarah mentioned earlier. So for us, identifying how different stakeholders needed to feel in order for them to engage in the project. For example, how they needed to feel in order for them to learn and gain certain things or do certain things differently was really crucial and important in helping us begin to see the outlines of various impact pathways within, this mass of project data that we collected over the years of implementation. So identifying how your project stakeholders feel and what they need to feel in order for them to engage it's not a typical outcome or output that's tracked, or that we even typically think about when we construct theories of change for our projects. So for us, after an initial scope of our various data sources, we found that our stakeholders, for them to engage in our project and be impacted by it, it was crucial for them to feel respected and consulted, a sense of trust and credibility in our work, empowered by the consultative nature of our work and our partnerships, and motivated to drive action to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse, and a sense of urgency as well. So after creating our outcome map, we began the process of breaking out our project outcomes into different impact stories. So this slide shows you an example of one impact story we're currently working on, and I want to note here that this is very much in progress. So this is kind of an analysis in progress you're seeing. But this impact pathway we've titled Aid Actors Proactively Identify and Respond to Sexual Exploitation and Abuse Risks in Their Programming. So to create this pathway, we started with the impact statement at the end here, that aid actors address and mitigate risky programming contexts. And then we dragged and dropped the various stepping stones you see under what we do, who with, how they feel, what they learn and gain, and what they do differently. And this helped us kind of create a story pathway that we thought we were seeing from our initial scoping of that mass of program data. And we've since been populating each of these stepping stones with data, quotes, information from the various sources to assess our progress and confidence for each one. So let's take the stepping stone, trust and credibility as an example. Here we go. So here you can see we've begun pulling quotes from the various project stakeholders, which attest to what we thought we were seeing in the high-level review of our data, that they felt a sense of trust and belief in the credibility of our findings, both from the participatory methods and the approaches we used. And the fact that our stakeholders felt that our findings generated, our findings generated alongside refugee women girl co-researchers reflected the realities that they saw and knew of on the ground. So here you can see the various sources we've also begun pulling these quotes from. This includes progress reports to our funders, final reports, and key staff reflection interviews. So just quickly, I want to show you this second pathway that's currently under development. This impact story is that refugee women and girls are able to access aid in ways that feel safer to them, which is kind of one of the ultimate goals of this project over the years. On the screen here, you can see that we've populated the first 3 columns with information we're fairly confident of, what we did for this impact story to make sense, which stakeholders were a part of this story, how those stakeholders felt or needed to feel. And you can see from the colors, the dark green represents a great sense of high confidence and great progress. As Sarah explained, the confidence rating reflects how confident we are in the statement, i.e. how much data we have to corroborate that statement. And the progress rating speaks to generally like the homogeneity or heterogeneity in the findings. So for example, you have lots of stakeholders saying they felt a sense of trust and credibility in our work, but we're giving that a confidence rating of some because we're still collecting and adding in more quotes. And we're continually and iteratively updating our synthesis as we go along. So for another example, shown here in the yellow under what they learn and gain, from our initial review of the data, we began to see that one of the things that our stakeholders here, refugee women, civil society organizations, and international humanitarian response organizations, what they began to learn and gain from engaging in our various streams of work and partnership was this sharpened sense of a socio-political and kind of feminist consciousness and lens around violence against women and girls, gender-based violence, and sexual exploitation and abuse. So we've marked this stepping stone in the progress rating as some, because we're still very actively populating the stepping stone, but we're also not sure yet if all of the stakeholders involved in this pathway would express that this was a major thing they gained from engaging in our work. But we do know with a great degree of confidence that for the refugee women and girl co-researchers, this was a highly relevant aspect that they learned and gained from our partnership with them. And so this is here, you can see we're drilling down into the empowered by the consultative nature of the participatory action, research, and implementation pilots. And we can see that we say with a higher degree of confidence that our refugee co-researchers felt that they learned and gained the sharpened feminist lens through which they kind of interpret the lived realities and inequities of the environments that they're living within. And we're not yet sure how strong this statement will be for our international humanitarian response partners, for example. So that just gives you a good idea of what this analysis process looks like in progress. And it's this kind of continual iterative approach, which has been very useful. So I just want to share a couple of like high-level reflections from our initial work with contribution analysis and using the OutNav software. The first is that for constructing well-evidenced impact stories, we found it really important to pinpoint how various project stakeholders need to feel in order for them to engage with our work and be impacted by it. The second is that by assessing the evidence behind each step in your impact stories, you're able to get a really clear and realistic picture of what you know and where you need to gather more data. And this is really crucial when working with like large amounts of diverse types of program data, monitoring data that we all are inundated with at the end of long projects. And OutNav's interface really aids with this process. And then lastly, in the case of empowered aid, what we know so far from our contribution analysis is that we can say with quite a high degree of confidence that creating trust and credibility with our co-researchers, our NGO partners, and our other stakeholders was really crucial for our impact across various domains of our project. So I'm going to hand it back over to my colleague, Sarah, to wrap us up and go into our kind of key takeaways, and then we'll share some final resources with you all before opening a Q&A.
Thank you, Andrea. So we wanted to just kind of highlight a few key takeaways. a lot of people, when we present this approach, are like, oh, but it seems a lot. Where do we start? And we very much advocate just starting somewhere. So I've used this approach to look back on things that have happened, to plan things from the start, to come in halfway and then put it together. And it doesn't really matter. But I think really what you want to do is just start somewhere. And the best place to start is really just to make yourself an outcome map theory of change that reflects the work that you do, and to plot a couple of pathways through it. So whatever stage you're at, it can be really good to do that and get everyone really clear about what it is you're doing and how it's happening. And quite often the process is about learning, not necessarily about having a shiny impact story. And I know in some settings, you know, if you're in a more evaluation frame of mind, you want to get there, but it doesn't have to be, you don't have to have everything in place. You could just start somewhere. I think it's really important to say that this is an evolving and reflective way to track impact, because it's acknowledging complexity. So if you started doing this at the start of a project, you might create a map, you know, which is your best guess at that point, or you're not even a guess, your most informed idea of how things are going to work. But of course, as they evolve, some things will emerge differently. Maybe you'll engage some stakeholders or not manage to engage others. Maybe some learning outcome will emerge from your data that you hadn't even considered. Maybe some sort of behavior, policy, practice change might become, you know, might be a new opportunity to influence something that you hadn't also thought of. Other things might drop away. And the idea very much is that it's something that should change. So once you've created one of these frameworks, you're not using it to kind of measure and beat yourself up with, you're using it as a way of really working through complexity and adapting to what emerges as you go on. And I suppose that means it does help with planning as well as evaluation. You know, it can be a tool to find your way in those complex environments. And I'm going to pass over to Alina for the other points.
Yes, thank you. So, you know, we've found very much that beyond evaluation, this has been helpful with assisting in just managing our intervention and thinking about, in the environments where we work, you know, it is very complex. Things are changing. We work with many partners. And we're excited to, now that we have some pathways populated, to open this up to conversations with our partners, because it's a different way of framing and understanding how all these things fit together, and also potentially looking across the different contexts where we work and engaging partners in some bigger thinking. And we actually have an in-person meeting coming up in August where we're going to do that. So this is a great tool for that. And just to say, finally, Andrea shared the spreadsheet that we had been using. I had been introduced to Dr. Martin's work when I worked at UNICEF. And so I knew, you know, it was important to track where we were seeing impact, or we were seeing kind of indications of change along the way, but it was turning into this massive spreadsheet, which was very intimidating to try to analyze. So the OutNav software, I have to say, is very user-friendly and really helps support doing this effectively. And I think, you know, so many of us, we collect a lot of data, and the analysis is where the rubber really hits the road. So having tools like this is very helpful to make sure that we can actually show, you know, some of the things that we know are happening in a systematic way, and in a way that is very visually compelling, as you saw with the color-coded system. Next slide. So we want to just leave you with a few resources and next steps, and we'll also be sharing the presentation with everyone who registers, so you'll be able to click on these. All of our resources and tools are on our website, which I'll also put in the chat. And then we have a handbook, How Do You Know If You're Making a Difference? A practical handbook for public service organizations, as well as a downloadable outcome map framework, and links to join our newsletters. So with that, we'd like to open it up for any questions or comments. You can put those in the Q&A box. And we'd also like to invite you to share resources or thoughts in the chat, you know, so others can access those resources. We realize there's a wealth of knowledge here in the Zoom room. And perhaps while folks are thinking of questions, I might pose one to Sarah to kick us off, which is something that I've been curious about. And this is whether you've seen the contributions analysis approach with or without the support of the OutNav software used by multiple organizations. So for example, partners or organizations working in a consortium. to actually kind of manage and understand impact among them.
Yeah, it can be a great way of getting a partnership on the same page about impact and outcomes. And maybe I'll give an example, which we were working on a project which was about food security in a specific community, and 4 organizations together had got funding to improve food security in this specific area. One of them was doing like education, one was doing like community food events, one was doing like financial advice, and one was doing, sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head, but they were basically 4 quite different approaches that were all contributing to the same outcomes. So together they made an outcome map, and then each project had its pathway. So then you can see how each partner is contributing to the same outcomes, and you can do a nice report for the funder that shows how the sum, you know, the parts all add up to something bigger than any one of the projects would. But you've also got that opportunity for each project, for each partner to see their distinct contribution and really highlight their distinct and how their way of doing things has contributed to those outcomes. So it is a way, it is a really good way. And I think the other thing that people generally have found helpful with it is it's almost like if you're in a partnership, you get everything out on the table. Well, why are we in this? What's in it for us? How do we think our bit works? How do other people's bit work? You can be really clear about where the overlaps are and where the distinctions are. And I think it's very reassuring for people in terms of that shared understanding of a process and a program. So I think it works really well for that. Like you say, with or without the software, it's still a great thing to do.
Thank you, Sarah. And we have a question from, I think, Cora. Apologies if I'm saying that incorrectly. Did you have any challenges in selecting which contributions or pathways to focus on, or the framing of them? Any advice on managing those conversations?
Shall I?
Maybe if you want to kick off, yeah.
Yeah.
And then I think, Andrea, maybe you could also add some reflections.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably one of the biggest conversations we have with our clients is there's so many ways to cut the cloth, you know, and how are you going to do it and what matters? So I think a real sense on who you're reporting to and why is a really important part of that. So what matters most? So you'll see the way Andrea had organized them was very much around outcomes. And that's one way of doing it, to say, okay, this outcome, what contributes to that, this outcome, and that works really well in some cases. Sometimes people organize pathways around the who with. So it might be, you know, I was working with a youth project, they had a whole tranche of work around young people and another tranche around parents. It made perfect sense to separate those out. Or we've had, and then the third one I would say is like the change mechanism. So how does change happen? So in one specific project, in fact, the one we use as an example, one set of work is working directly with people. And that's kind of one way of creating change. And the other one is sharing our work with the sector in order to move the sector on. And that's another sort of change process. So sometimes it makes sense to separate out those change processes. But I always say to anyone, you've got to think, why are you doing this? Who are you telling the story to? As much as what makes most logical, intellectual sense. So I think those are the 2 considerations.
Yeah, and I think I would just add from the Empowered Aid, our experience of our contribution analysis so far, to pull from what Sarah said, you know, we really wanted to focus on highlighting what the change processes were, because we had so much anecdotal evidence that we were making impact, but we really wanted to understand what were the factors that went into it. And from, you know, what Alina shared about our project, the kind of first part of the project really focused on participatory action research. And the second part of the project focused on essentially supporting NGO partners to be able to implement some of these participatory methods themselves in a variety of different contexts. So it was kind of a scaling up and scaling out phase of the approach. And while we weren't going through participatory action research itself with our partners, obviously it's not feasible for them, we were using a lot of the same approaches and the same ways of engaging. And so we wanted to understand those change pathways across these 2 different phases of the project. So we decided to keep it all together and look at these different outcomes that we saw as kind of building on each other throughout the 6 years of our project. And that's a great question.
Yeah.
In the absence of not another question, I've got a question for you two. Can I ask
Go
it?
ahead.
Yeah. So you say you're going to do this validation session, which is always what I would do as well, like spend some time with the people. Do you think, how are you going to do it? Are you going to use OutNav, or do you think you'll do something else? And how is it going to work? Or maybe this is too early for this question, but I thought I'd just pose it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we've been giving updates to the core team along the way, but I think OutNav is really useful because of the visual pathways and the color coding. One thing I think we have to figure out is how to represent. We have quite a lot of data in some of those, and so I think because we're doing it with stakeholders who are pretty familiar with the project, we can probably just signpost what we've been talking about and then pull out some specific quotes or examples. But I'd really, like it to be accessible for them in terms of thinking about, how are we rating our confidence and our progress and validating that with a wider group of people. And I know there are some guides around that on the OutNav website, and you can also make your own kind of indicators around that.
Yeah.
But we want to make sure that, that piece is really validated and everyone feels that they've had a voice in kind of discussing that, and then also have time to look at maybe where we have progress left to make, because we're at a point where the project funding is ending and we're looking at new funding, new kind of ways to evolve the work. So this is actually really informative for us to see, what can we build on and where can we strengthen.
Yeah, and we quite often host what we would call a collective analysis session, and we get people to say, oh, is this what you think? Is it surprising? Which is the kind of things we would have definitely done, I've done in other parts of my career, sharing emerging findings and asking people to reflect on them. But I think when we do it, if we're doing it virtually, then it works quite well in OutNav, because you can actually give people the data right in front of them, and you've got that, as you say, the rating gives people a sort of sense of, oh yes, I agree or disagree. I think, I'm not sure the progress is that good. Oh no, the progress is much better. Those kind of conversations can be really rich.
Yeah. So we will pivot to kind of the closing of the webinar. We don't want to take more than an hour of your time, but we hope that you've enjoyed hearing about this approach, the resources available for Matter of Focus, and our experience with it. And I'll hand over to Andrea to share a few final messages.
Yeah, we just want to really make sure to thank our funders, the U.S. State Department, Department of Population, Refugees, and Migration, and as well, really extend a warm thank you to our colleagues at Matter of Focus. It's been really fantastic using the software and getting the chance to share an analysis process kind of in progress. I think that's can be very helpful for people. And we want to encourage you to please connect with us. So you can please draw on these emails when you receive the slides after the webinar. And just a quick note and plug for you all, if you're interested in learning on how to adapt empowered aid for your context or work, please consider attending our webinar tomorrow on adapting monitoring and evaluation tools to monitor SEA risks and programs. This is the latest webinar in a 3-part series we've been running. And I think Alina is going to post the webinar link in the chat, and we'll follow up with that as well later today. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. It's been great to have you here. Thank you all.
And we will be sharing the recording and the presentation with everyone who registered. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.